ever since Generation 1 of Pokemon, we've always had these very small, very adorable little bug types that you find near the beginning of the game that are to show the new players, here's how evolution works. We have Caterpie, Weedle, Ladybus, Spinnerack, Wurmple, Kricketot, Sewaddle, Venipede, Scatterbug, Grubbin, Blipbug. And you know what all these have in common? They're absolutely garbage in Little Cup. None of them are worthwhile. None of them, except for Sewaddle because it's got chlorophyll. But otherwise, they're all awful. None of them are really any. None of them are of any value. What is Caterpie gonna do with this barren move pool? What's Spinnerack gonna do? Baton pass into Spiderweb or something? Who knows? It's got terrible stats anyway. It's not gonna be able to do that effectively. So is there anything that's actually gonna break this cycle? Are all of these bug Pokemon designed to be one failure after another and just have nothing worthwhile for any of them? The simple answer is no, because we have Nymble now. And it's... I don't know how, but in Scarlet and Violet, it's now B+ rank. B+. Like, all of the other ones. Caterpie all the way up to Grubbin and Blipbug. All of them are genuinely awful, yet somehow Nymble, this Route 1 early bug type, has got all of them beat by miles, being able to be that viable. B+, on the same tier as Marionette. And everybody knows how annoying Toxapex is. What changed to make these Route 1 bugs finally something to watch out for in Little Cup? What changed? Well, to give you a little bit of a comparison here, if we sort by lowest base stat total, the 11th one is Nymble at 210 base stat total. 210. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And if you're running, oh, well, you know, here's Girafarig. If we go to the viability rankings, that's S rank. That's the best in the tier. Where's that at? 455. Literally more than double. And you're trying to tell me that this little idiot bug is somehow still viable when this is around. How does that make sense? Well, the simple answer is, it's got a great ability, a wonderful move pool, and decent enough stats that it can do exactly what you want it to do. It's literally at the point where it's just a Dark Souls protagonist. You are a giant Dark Souls whenever you're piloting a Nymble. It's so funny. First, let's go over the ability. The ability is Tinted Lens. This Pokemon's attacks that are not very effective on a target deal double damage, meaning that even resists such as Glimmet, because it's a poison type, poison resists bug. Even though this resists the bug type moves, it's still going to take it as if it's a neutral move, which is pretty important in the grand scheme of things when you don't have any resist functionally. Quadruple resist, they'll only do half damage, and that is an important distinction because there are some quadruple resist in the tier, but unless you're those two specific Pokemon, you're going to get wrecked by this really, really easily, and that's pretty good. Next up is the item of Life Orb. Holders' attacks do 1.3 times damage, and you lose 1/10 of your max HP after every attack. So this seems like such a downside, and people are like, well, dude, your HP stat is so low already, why are you going to keep on decreasing it? Well, the thing with Life Orb is that it's 1/10 of your max HP, and this is always rounded down. So if we go back to Nymble's max HP, it's 19 without investment. And the thing is, Pokemon really, really, really likes rounding down, so this 19 gets rounded down to a 1 when it comes to 1/10, meaning that you have 19 attacks that you can send off, as opposed to only 10, which is frankly ridiculous in the best way possible. Now let's get into the moves. So first up, we have First Impression. It's a 90 base power bug type move. Hits first turn out only. It has a priority of +2, meaning that you'll outspeed stuff like Sucker Punch. If you're facing against a Pawniard and it uses Sucker Punch as you use First Impression, the Sucker Punch will not come out because First Impression has higher priority. It's really useful for that reason, because that means that even though some Pokemon like to run priority, like Pawniard, you can run Aqua Jet on Quaxley, for example. The issue there is they can't defend against this. They have to take the hit. And that can be really hard to deal with, especially because it's Stab, Bug, and you can't resist it because of Tinted Lens. You also have Leech Life, which recovers 50% of your damage that you deal. It's 80 base power, also Stab. It's good. Some people have also considered running Fent instead. And the reason why you want Fent is because it's also the same priority as First Impression. So it can get a little bit of chip damage that you wouldn't get in otherwise, and that can be really valuable. But back to Leech Life, the reason why that's so valuable is because you recover off the damage that you deal, which means that Life Orb recoil is offset, which means that your opponent can't just wait for this to die. It's like, oh, you know, I'll just keep on using Sucker Punch and First Impression or whatever, and then just slowly die out of the course of the game. Nah, it has Leech Life, so it'll stay pretty healthy. Next up, you have Sucker Punch. Even though First Impression is a better priority move because it's stab and +2 priority, it can only be used on the first turn out, and that can lead to some complications. So in order to make sure that you still have a priority move that can hit when you want it to hit, you have Sucker Punch. And although it's a little bit conditional because it feels if your target is not attacking, it's still good priority to have. Finally, you have U-Turn, which means that you switch out after damaging the target. So if somebody's like, oh, well, I'm going to go to my Quaxley so that way I can take this Nymble's hits kind of well, even though it might be able to take 1 or 2, it gets U-turned on, and then you go into a counter like a Scarf Magnemite, into Marionette, all these other sorts of things that would be able to wall this pretty effectively. And also, one last thing about the stats is that your defense and speed are surprisingly good as well. 40 base defense is not bad, as well as 45 speed getting you up to 14. And as with Quaxley, as I said before, it's like, oh, well, its speed stat is also 14, which means that if it's Quaxley versus Nymble, then it's going to be a speed tie, which means that neither of you has a great advantage. It's pretty funny. And one of the reasons why U-Turn is so important is that not only does it reinforce the fact that you're just a Dark Souls protagonist, but it's like, oh look, there's danger, I'll just roll around it, it's fine. You also get to go into one of your many allies that you can use pretty effectively. And the first one that we have is Diglett. And what Diglett's ability in Arena Trap does is that your opponent cannot switch out, which means that they have to deal with this interaction. And the reason why that's important is because it's really good at just picking and removing certain mods. So for example, if we have this Glimmet, it's Rock Poison, Quadruple Weakness, 2 ground attacks. If you U-turn on the Glimmet coming in, and then you go into Diglett, that means that this Glimmet is removed for the rest of the game, barring anything like Air Balloon or Terror or whatever. So it could be a really reliable way of getting rid of your checks, which is really nice. You can also use something like Gothita instead, and that'll also work because it's got Stab Psychic, and you can get up to 21 speed with a Choice Scarf. So you can still do stuff with that. It's just that it's less preferred because you need the Scarf, and that can be a bit unreliable when you have to lock into a move in order to be able to trap something. Next up, we have Quaxley, and the reason why you like Quaxley is because it's got Rapid Spin. You have a Stealth Rock weakness as a result of your bug typing, so being able to get rid of those rocks is really, really nice. You also have Roost, Liquidation, and Brave Bird, meaning that for the most part, Quaxley and Nymble are going to have roughly the same checks, and that's good because that means you get to put more pressure on them. It means that Marionette has to deal with 2 threats on your team. They don't just have to deal with the Nymble, they also have to deal with Quaxley, and as a result, it can be a bit hard to deal with both the combination of Quaxley and Nymble. Roost keeps you healthy, so that means you can keep on coming in, so it can be even more annoying for your opponent to deal with. Next up, we have Toadschool. Toadschool also has Rapid Spin, but what is also really important is the fact that you have Earth Power, and Earth Power allows you to break over stuff like Glimmet, as I mentioned earlier. You can also break over Tinkatink and Pawniard, giving you a pretty good stab option in order to wear down the checks that would otherwise hamper your Nymble. You also have Knockoff, which is the best move in Little Cup because it removes Eviolite, and what Eviolite does is that it boosts your defense and special defense by 1.5 times, meaning that anything that has an Eviolite is instantly significantly more bulky. By removing that, it opens up your entire team, not just the Nymble, but by weakening your Nymble's checks on the opponent's team, it can be really, really useful. It means that they no longer have as reliable of an answer, meaning that you can do even more damage and put your opponent even more on the back foot. It's really good. Next up is Spore. You can also do stuff like Power Whip. Like, honestly, Toadschool is one of the most flexible mons in this metagame. Power Whip, you can also do Giga Drain. You have a lot of options, but you prefer Spore because that means that you can put an opponent's Pokemon to sleep, which means that they're going to be out of commission for 1 to 3 turns, which can be really useful for pivoting around. Like, oh, well, my opponent's asleep now, that means that I have a free switch into Nymble, which can put on more offensive pressure, or it's just one of the Nymble's checks, which means that, oh, well, it's perfectly fine, because then it can't come in and check me as reliably, because I can just start first Leech Lifing into it, or U-turn out, and you have effectively gained nothing because your opponent's Mon is asleep. And then finally, Glimmet is here as the entirety of hazard stack. Having hazards on your opponent's side of the field is really good, because one of the best ways of dealing with Nymble is just switching around it. Like, oh, well, you know, it comes in, I can go to my check, and then my check can take the damage, and then it's all A-okay. But if there's rocks and spikes up, if there's toxic spikes up, then they're going to keep on getting passively worn down, meaning that's going to be much harder for them to be able to check your Nymble. And that's also in addition to, oh, well, that means that I can get my Diglett in, and then my opponent's going to be in a certain range. That means that it can be trapped because of the hazards that wouldn't be there before. It's all pretty nice. So now that I've gone over the benefits, what exactly do you want to hit with Nymble? Because I mean, like, oh, well, it could just be good on paper, and then it's terrible in practice. Well, the first thing you hit is the 455 base stat total Giraffering. And you're thinking, well, that's kind of dumb. Can't this take the attack kind of well? No. Not at all. First Impression has a almost guaranteed chance to KO. Also, ignoring Stealth Rock and Spikes, which it doesn't change the roll, but it can be really useful for other stuff. It's just so absurd that, like, oh yeah, you know, this is 210. That doesn't mean jack squat. I am John Dark Souls. I will kill every last one of the Abyss Watchers that is Giraffering. It's perfectly fine. I don't know why that works. It just does. But yeah, First Impression can kill this Giraffering, and it's all A-okay. And the funny thing is that you can also run stuff on Giraffering like a Wish set that's very passive, has Protect and Wish to keep it healthy. And it's like, oh, well, then First Impression doesn't work. But then the thing is that you still have Leech Life in order to put pressure on it. You still recover back HP, and that means that Giraffering has a hard time hitting you back. And then you can also U-turn out on it wishing, and that means that you get your own momentum. So that way you can do with Giraffering a lot better. All this sorts of stuff. It's pretty nice. As a result, you will have a wonderful matchup versus Giraffering, providing it's not running Protect. And even if it is using Protect, you can get around that because you also have Sucker Punch as well as U-turn. So that way you can get other things in, as well as take a little bit of damage. Next up, we have Toadschool. I mentioned this is actually a really good partner, but you smack this really, really well. If we go over to the viability rankings, S rank, Giraffering, A+ rank, Toadschool, you're hitting some big threats here. It's not like these are like little guys. These are the big boys. And being able to hit the Toadschool, as well as be able to come in on a rapid spin. It really likes rapid spinning to remove hazards. So if we go to the calc once again, and then we go to the usual Toadschool spread, then First Impression is a guaranteed KO. Leech Life, almost guaranteed. U-turn, not as good, but you just need a little bit of ship and it's fine. But the point of all of this is that Rapid Spin also does very little to you in return. And in order for Toadschool to be able to spore you or use any of its stabs in Earth Power or Power Whip, which are resisted, it's going to have a hard time making a lot of progress versus your Nymble, which can mean a lot in the grand scheme of things, because that means, well, you have to threaten out, the Toadschool has to go, and you have to go into your other checks, but that means that they're going to probably be taking hazards if Toadschool has Rapid Spun. And it can be really, really hard in order to play around the Nymble, because I have my Toadschool in, so what do? Next up, we have Deerling, and Deerling is the same rank as Nymble. It's in B+ tier, but the reason why it's so much more important in this matchup is because Deerling has Serene Grace, which doubles the secondary effect chance of Pokemon's moves, which includes Headbutt and Zen Headbutt, which can make your target flinch. You can also use something like Body Slam, and that has a 30% chance to paralyze the target, which means that Deerling can do Paraflinch, Paralyze into Flinch, which means that you have a really low chance of moving. And because you have First Impression, which always goes first, you subvert this entire thing and just smack it. It also means that it doesn't have an opportunity to use Synthesis or Thunder Wave on you, meaning that if Deerling comes in, you have a really good opportunity of getting a lot of momentum very quickly. Next up, we have Diglett, and you can also add Gothita in the slot as well, but it deals with the Trappers exceedingly well, because both of the Trappers are very frail. Diglett is a Glass Cannon, 10 HP and 25 defense, a defensive Pokemon does not make. So as a result, oh, well, you know, it's trying to claim some of my stuff, but I can just go into my Nymble. It can take Earthquake kind of well because it's a resist and it's got some amount of defense, and then it can clap back with a really hard First Impression. As a result, it can deal with Trappers pretty well, get them out of there. And then if they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to switch. Okay, well, then you can just U-turn to get the momentum back. And if they switch into something else, then That means that you've worn them down more through hazards, and it just scares them out, so you don't have to deal with them anymore. Next up, we have Olive Rain. Weasel is the best, well, the most noteworthy face of Rain. It's in B+, along with Psyduck. But what makes Weasel so much more important is just when it comes to the calcs of Weasel, Nymble First Impression has a 60-ish% chance to OHKO after Stealth Rock, and Weasel's new stab move in Wave Crash. So if I go to that real quick, what Wave Crash does is it has 33% recoil. So every time you attack with it, you're going to be taking some damage. So that's important because that means that even though in the calculation the Nymble does not have a guaranteed KO, you're still good enough because Weasel's going to be taking chip, whether it's from rocks, whether it's from Wave Crash, whether it's for something else. It's not going to be at max HP all the time. So it's going to be more manageable as a result. And Weasel, what it really likes doing is that because of Swift Swim doubling its speed and its base speed stat of 19, that means that you just outpace the entirety of the rest of the tier, meaning that you don't have to worry about taking hits. You can just keep on spamming Wave Crash and it's all A-okay. But because Nymble's First Impression is not based on speed, that means that you don't have to worry about that. Weasel just gets absolutely knocked out of the park. It's all A-okay. You don't have to worry about it. And then finally, some setup sweepers. Choodle is the stand-in for this one because you have Shell Smash, and you also like doing Terra-type Dark Crunch for Girafarig, but because you lowered your defenses, it's all A-okay. And one of the biggest advantages of First Impression, as I've been saying with like the Swift Swim boost and the Shell Smash boost, is that like if for example I want to deal with this Girafarig, and I'm using a Scarf Ghastly to do so, because Scarf Ghastly is faster than Girafarig on baseline, well then Girafarig can just use Trailblaze, get a speed boost, and then it's faster than Ghastly. Ghastly's stuck, it can't do anything, it's just going to die to Psychic Fangs the next turn. However, if I have Nymble instead with First Impression, that means that I don't care about how fast the Girafarig is, it's going to get hit either way. So as a result, it has a really valuable niche as a revenge killer that doesn't need to be fast. And that can be really good, especially when there's stuff like webs going around with Surskit. And it likes doing Sticky Web, and what Sticky Web does is that it lowers your speed. Nymble doesn't care about that either. First Impression just goes first because of the +2 priority. It's all A-okay. And as a result, it's exceedingly valuable. And it's pretty crazy. But what's going to get in the way? Well, I mentioned the 2 quad resistances. This is one of them. It's Ghastly. I mentioned it before with the Scarf set, but you can use a more defensive set, do like Will-O-Wisp Hex, something like that. But the reason why Ghastly isn't used very often defensively is that it's got a really bad defensive stats, 30 HP, 30 defense. And even though it has a quadruple resist on your Bug-type moves, it's still going to be taking quite a lot because of how low its stat line is. You have to be really careful when attacking into Ghastly, though, because you're thinking, oh, well, you know, it can take the First Impression just fine because it's a quadruple resist, but it can't take the Sucker Punch afterwards. Alright, but what happens if it's using Will-O-Wisp? What happens if it uses Substitute? And then you don't get to attack into the Ghastly, and now you're just up a crick. So what are you going to do now? That being said, you can still deal with it with Sucker Punch, as well as its low bulk, so you got to deal with it pretty well, but it's just something to keep in mind. Next up, I've been saying, like, oh yeah, Marionette, it's really bulky, it's got 16 defense with positive nature, it's got a poison typing, and it can be really hard to break over as a result of how many resistances are afforded because of poison water typing, in addition to recover as well as regenerator, meaning it's really hard to wear down efficiently, as well as consistently. Before in previous gen, you could knock it off really easily, go into coughing, and that made it okay, not perfect, but when there's no knockoff to really be seen, there's only 7 knockoff users in the current tier, and 3 of them are worth using, it's just really easy to be like, oh, well, Marionette's not going to deal with them. So how are you going to be able to break over Marionette with your Nymble? Well, the best you can do is U-turn out into a support Pokemon, because it's not going down. And even with the hazard support, you still have Regenerator, so if you're not attacking into the Marionette, you're not doing anything yourself, it can be really, really hard to break. Next up, we have Larvesta, and it gets a special mention because it's got Flame Body as its ability, and that means that it will burn your Pokemon if it attacks into it. And the reason why that's important is that burn reduces the power points. So if we go to U-turn, you see power. That will be reduced by 50% if you're burned. So Nymble's normally 70 base power U-turn will be reduced to 35, and that's significantly worse. In addition, Larvesta can just heal off the damage with Morning Sun. It can Will-O-Wisp things in the back. And if you First Impression on it, it can just U-turn out the following turn, at which point it's perfectly fine with it because you have the faster U-turn. You have to switch out first. So if you're like, oh, well, I can deal with this Larvesta by going into my Marionette, it's all A-okay. However, it can just U-turn and return, and it's like, oh, well, you go to your own Marionette, and then your opponent goes into a Scarf Magnemite or a Diglett, be able to trap this Marionette, and then you're stuck up a creek again. What are you going to do? It does have a Stealth Rock weakness, but like that can also be exploitable because, oh, well, they have Toadschool as their spinner, and they have Quaxley, but it can be really annoying if you don't have the proper support set up to deal with this Larvesta. The good news about Larvesta and Marionette is that they can both be trapped by Diglett. That cannot be said for the next one of Crabrawler, and the main reason why it can't is because it's very physically defensive. It's got a good amount of defensive estimates ready, it's got Bulk Up, it's got Drain Punch, it's really hard to keep this down. And what you could do is that you could use Gothita, but the issue with Gothita is, as I said before, it's Choice Scarf, and that means that you're locked into one move, meaning that you cannot switch moves. So, for example, in this Crabrawler, if it wants to hit into this Marionette, it can use Thunder Punch. But then if your opponent switches into Larvesta, then it's like, oh, well, instead of using Thunder Punch, I can use Crab Hammer instead. I have options. Gothita is not allowed this, and it's the best trapper of Crabrawler. So Crabrawler, as a result, is a really good check because it can keep itself healthy with Drain Punch, it can bulk up in order to make itself harder to deal with, and it can be a bit of setup fodder. That being said, you can always U-turn out on Crabrawler and then go into a Psychic type like Girafarig or Gothita, so it's not awful, but it's a bad matchup nonetheless. Next up is our second quadruple bug resistance in Tinkatink, which is Fairy Steel type, which many argue is the best typing in the entirety of the game. And why this is so scary to face is that it's got Stealth Rock on itself on baseline, meaning that it can come in, take your first impression, and then it can set up Stealth Rock to limit your capabilities later on in the game, which can be really annoying. You also have Thunder Wave, so that way if you're like, oh, well, then I'll just go U-turn into something that can deal with this better, like my own Crabrawler, and this one has Earthquake, or whatever. But then the issue there is like, oh, well, then I can just Thunder Wave the Crabrawler coming in, and now Crabrawler's kind of ruined, so that's going to be rough. It's got Play Rough as a pretty good stab option that can do quite a bit of damage, even with its kind of bad attack stat of 45. Then you can also use Knockoff to remove items. Without your Life Orb, you don't do as much damage as you want to do, which can be really yikes. But it's manageable. Also, Terra-type Grass. This deserves a special mention because Terra-type Grass means that you're no longer trapped, and that can be really, really... it can be an issue. And the reason why I'm saying not trapped is that Diglett uses Ground Stab in order to be able to deal with Tinkatink because it's Fairy Steel, therefore weak to ground types. One of the best resistances to ground is Grass, and as a result, it runs Terra-type Grass. Same goes for Glimmet. It likes running Terra-type Grass if it's going to be a more bulkier set. But the reason for that is that way it can take a lot of hits and doesn't get trapped. And because of its ability Toxic Debris, if this Pokemon is hit by a physical attack, Toxic Spikes are set on the opposing side, which can be quite the liability if you're trying to U-turn around this. Because even if you gain the momentum, it's like, oh, well, it's fine. I understand that they're going to go into their Glimmet on my Nymble coming in, so I can just U-turn out. But then they get progress by setting up Toxic Spikes, which means that you have to spin away the spikes and or have a poison type to deal with the Glimmet, and that can be a bit awkward when it comes to positioning. So this is also why it's really good as a partner, because if your opponent's been taking a whole bunch of poison damage because they're trying to check your Glimmet, like if a Larvesta gets poisoned, that's going to be much less reliable as a check, especially like a Crabrawler or a Larvesta. That can be really hard for them to come back from because the passive damage keeps on racking up and racking up and racking up. So that's why it's good, but it's bad because if you attack into it, it'll get set up in your side, and then it can also set up Stealth Rock, hit you really hard with Power Gem, and then set up Spikes as well to be really annoying with. And that's all your main hindrances and all your targets. And you're probably thinking, all right, so what's like a lot of the top players are probably going to be wanting you using this, right? So what's going on there? Well, if we go to the kickoff tour, so this is Scarlet Violet Little Cup Tournament, and what this is that we have the usage stats. And what the usage stats are is that, just for example, Girafarig. We have rank 1 Girafarig. How often is it used? This is the number of usages that it has. The usage percentage overall is 75%. How many games were played in week 6? That's how many they were on. And then what's the win percentage for that week? So, Nymble has 2 usages and it wins 50% of the time. That's pretty good. But then also, if you look at the cumulative stats, this is for every single week that it's been there. You go on down to 22nd, Nymble has a 62.5% win percentage, which is above the average of 50, and it doesn't even have that high of a usage. It is great. There's no understanding it. Even in like these high-end tournaments, like this is not just like low-end stuff. This is the kickoff tournament finals. People are still using it, and we can even see that in this game. This is CM Doge versus Elfuzion. This was in kickoff tournament, and CM Doge is the one who has the Nymble. Elfuzion's trying to defend against it. And Elfuzion looks pretty well defended. I mean, like, you have the Glimmet as a resist, you have Ghastly as a quadruple resist, and you have a Quaxly, which is pretty physically bulky. Versus a Toadschool, a Crabrawler, their own Glimmet, and the Nymble. So it should be a-okay. Like, these are top players. For context, Elfuzion in Little Cup Championships is the number 2 seed with 1,100 points. The number 12 seed, who is the last one who could have possibly gotten in, is around 400. He's really, 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 really good. It's not to be understated. But if I just let this play a little bit, Glimmet terrestrializes into a grass type, takes the earth power, all very standard, all the normal. And then Toadschool can't deal with it too well as a result of that grass type, so Toadschool just has to die here. It's unfortunate, but that's just how it is. So it goes down, at which point Nymble comes in. And why this is important is because the Terra types of both Glimmet and Nymble, I'm sorry, not Nymble, Glimmet and Tinkatink are both grass type, meaning that Nymble can now just come in, first impression them, and they can't do anything about it. So Elfu's in a really tight spot, because even if Ghastly wants to come in, it's still really frail, and it has to be able to win this game because it's the fastest thing. Like, Quaxly and Glimmet, you can also see, like, it says speed 9 to 16. You typically run max speed on stuff, but Ghastly's max speed is 18, Crabrawler is 17, Glimmet's 16. If Elfu wants to win, he's going to have to either set up his Quaxly or he's going to have to use Ghastly. Ghastly's really valuable. He doesn't need Glimmet, so CM Doge just goes for the first impression. Really good claim there because that means Elfu's on the back foot. Then Quaxly comes in. Then CM Doge can go to Glimmet. And then Elfu's going to try and set up his Quaxly so that way it can win the rest of the game. But then the stupid thing is, you know how I said that Nymble has, like, just enough defense to be passable? Yeah, it just casually takes a liquidation. It's fine. And then you're thinking, oh, well, I thought my Quaxly was going to be safe. What do you mean, Terra Bug? And now Elfu has lost the game because Nymble is just too powerful as a cleaner. And it's so hard for him to be able to deal with it. It's like, oh, well, Ghastly can yeah, but then Sucker Punch, as I mentioned before. You have to be able to attack into stuff. And as a result, CM Doge wins the game. Like, this isn't just like, oh, well, it's just like some random people on ladder using this. It's a whole bunch of no-name scrubs. No. These are top players. They know what they're doing, and they have understood that Nymble, the little Route 1 bug that everybody thinks is going to be stupid and dumb and bad, is actually really, really, really good. It has finally betrayed the legacy of Caterpie, Weedle, Ledybus, Spinny-Rack. All these mons. They couldn't live up to it. But then, Nymble could do that. It could go the distance. It became the Dark Souls protagonist. Just don't let it get hit. And even, it could take a hit if it needs to. It's incredible how far the bug types have finally gotten, that the Route 1 little baby Pokemon that are just used to establish what real evolution is, finally have their place in Little Cup. It's truly amazing. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you could like, share, and subscribe, that would be a wonderful favor you could do for me. But don't feel any pressure to do so. Thank you very much for just giving me your time. That's the most important bit. I'm hoping that I'm entertaining to you, and then you come back and see my content again. Thank you very much, and have a good day.